Welcome to round 6 of the World Chess Championship. In the previous round, Ding lost his game with the black pieces, and now Nepo is leading the match with 1 point. Now, in the previous World Chess Championship where Jan played against Magnus Carlsen, he lost in round 6 against Magnus. So this may be a very important game, as if Nepo survived this game, not only will he be a point ahead, he will also basically break this curse of round 6, so to say. So let's see what happened in today's game, as Ding is with the white pieces playing. So Ding started today with the move d4. Knight f6 was the response, knight f3, d5, and here bishop f4, the London. Now, this, of course, makes me much less excited about the game because the London is one of those openings you're like, whatever. But maybe Ding can make it somewhat exciting, right? c5 was played, which is the typical response against the London. e3 was played, knight c6, knight bd2, and this is a very normal setup. White goes for c3, bishop d3, short castle, and you go from there. C takes d4 was played, e takes d4, bishop f5, c3, e6. These are all very standard, normal developing moves. Bishop b5, activating the bishop over here, as you can't really play bishop d3 anymore because the bishop got to f5. So you put your bishop on b5, attacking this knight on c6, and potentially prepare knight e5. And white will not be so upset about losing the pair of bishops, because after bishop takes c6, b takes c6, the pawn on c6 might become a weakness. So for that reason, bishop b5 can be interesting. Bishop d6 was played, bishop takes d6 was a response. Usually we see moves like bishop g3 being played, but perhaps in this situation where the bishop on b5 is not placed on d3, it makes less sense to retreat that bishop, and it makes more sense to simply trade, because now also this knight can jump to e5 whenever they want to, and yeah, it makes a lot more sense in this very specific position. Short castle, rook e1, simply making sure that e5 won't happen that easily. h6, and now knight e5, controlling that very important square. Knight e7, of course, black doesn't want to trade. If knight takes e5, that would lose material, as this pawn would be attacking the pieces over here. And of course, you don't want to allow the capture on c6, once again, allowing this black pawn to be so weak over here. Knight e7 was played for that reason. a4, white is expanding on the queen side. a6, bishop f1, the bishop simply retreats all the way to f1. That's a very solid place to be in, and it doesn't interfere with anything in white's position. Knight d7, there we see a trade of knights. a5, and now it feels like white is getting slowly better and better and better, because with the move a5, you're fixing this pawn structure on the queen side, and you're also creating really nice squares for your pieces. Now, b6 is a square that white really wants to put a piece on, specifically a knight, and c5 is also one of those squares, because it's really difficult for black to play the move b6 and try to cover this square properly. So queen c7 was played, queen f3, rook fc8, rook a3. Now white is simply moving up the rook and trying to involve it on the queen side a bit more, as it is only defending this pawn on a5, and white is looking for more here, of course. Bishop g6, knight b3, there goes the knight towards the square that we're looking for here, c5, so knight c6, because now if knight c5, this pawn will be lost. So queen g3, queen e7, black doesn't want to trade queens. It makes perfect sense, because with the queens on the board, you can still try to navigate and try to find some chances, some counterplay. Once the queens are off the board, it may be much more difficult for black to actually do anything useful. So queen e7, h4, rook e8, knight c5. It's really beautiful to see that Ding is trying to play here on both sides. It's really hard to see what black can actually do in the meantime. Where are the breakthroughs for black? Because you cannot push e5, you cannot push b6, and it feels like any move, any pushing move, will only make your position worse. So you cannot just weaken your position like that. So that makes black's position really difficult, and that's why also e5 was played here, because you have to do something here. But now the move rook b3 happens, which looks pretty crazy since you're basically sacrificing a pawn, and what do you have for it? Let's take a look, because knight takes a5 was played, and here rook takes e5, an intermediate move. White is completely fine with, you know, losing those two rooks because, well, first of all, if knight takes b3, rook takes e7, and you also lose the knight over here, so that is not ideal. That doesn't work for black. But yeah, you're simply attacking the queen, so black has to move the queen now. Queen f6 was played, rook a3, and this pawn in the center that was on e5 previously is much more important than this pawn on a5. And we'll see now why. Knight c4 was played. The knight doesn't have any good square, really, because if you go back to c6, well, the d5 pawn is still hanging. That's quite a problem. If you play b6, rook takes d5, simply drops the pawn as well. So knight c4 is a nice attempt to try to save your position, as rook takes d5 drops the rook on a3. So bishop takes c4, d takes c4, and h5. Now we're back to another position where one side has a knight and the opponent has a bishop. In a previous game, we saw the same dynamic where white had the knight and black had the bishop. And despite the open position, more or less, black could not move this bishop and use it properly. It was just standing there, had access to many squares, but what was it actually doing? What was it actually able to do? Nothing. So we are in a similar position here where this bishop, it looks like it's a great bishop. It is open, it has access to so many squares on this diagonal, but what can it actually do against white? It's really hard to see. So bishop c2, there it goes. But hey, there is another pawn that drops, queen b6, and here comes knight d6, a brilliant move. Why? Because after queen takes d6, which seems like it's just a free knight, you are facing rook takes e8, check, and you lose the queen like that. So that's why taking on d6 is not a good idea. But what else? What is there for black? Now, black tries, of course, rook takes e5, because, yeah, what else do you have? Queen takes e5, queen takes b2, rook a5, and it was in this position that it looks like you're simply dropping a pawn, right? But the problem is that if you play queen takes c3 now, which is, by the way, not played, but I just want to illustrate why this move is not good, there's knight e8. A really sneaky move, because you're all of a sudden threatening checkmate. Of course, if you take the knight, you're simply going to lose a game, because after rook takes e8, queen takes e8 check, the king has to move, and you're saving your rook. You're moving it pretty much anywhere, preferably on d5, so that you can defend the pawn on d4. But yeah, that's why this doesn't work, and you cannot just capture the pawn on c3. And anything else, for example, f6 will be met with, let's say, queen e7 or queen d5 check, because there's a rook hanging, and all of a sudden, there's many more problems in the position. So that's why Nepo played the prophylactical move, king h7, stepping out of that check zone, because after rook c5, which was played by Ding, now queen takes c3 is possible. Let's imagine Ding played any other move, let's say king h2. Now all of a sudden you can take on c3, and the idea with knight e8 doesn't work anymore, because rook takes e8, and you cannot just capture it back, because you also lose your rook here, and that means you'll be down a piece. So that's why this move king h7 was so good. Now let's go back to the game, because here is where Ding played rook c5 instead, of course, because yeah, you're attacking this pawn and getting out of that dangerous position with that rook. Queen c1 check was played, king h2. Queen takes c3, by the way, would have been possible, but for some reason Nepo did not go for this line. So queen c1 check instead, king h2, f6, trying to kick away the queen from there, queen g3, a5. Of course, Nepo tries to find some counterplay because you have a passed pawn, but is that enough to save the position here? Knight takes c4 was played, a4, there goes the pawn, knight e3, bishop b1, rook c7, threatening checkmate over here. So rook g8, of course, to defend that. Knight goes to d5, another threat in the position. King goes back to h8, rook a7, trying to sort of stop the pawn. Very useful move. Knight e7 brings up the knight, rook f8. d5, and slowly but surely Ding is getting to a position where things get really tricky for black, because, well, how do you keep defending the position, right? And the bar is actually moving up and down because it is not in a high enough depth. The higher the depth is, the more it believes white's position. And I believe around this position, it was already like +7 on very high depth. So take the eval bar with a grain of salt right now, because it's currently on depth 20. A2, queen c7. White is bringing the queen in on the 7th rank, because after king h7, there's knight g6, and you're attacking the rook, attacking on g7, rook g8 was played, and queen f7, which was the only move winning the game, and this is where Jan resigned. Jan resigned in this very position because whatever black does here, let's make a random move. First of all, if you want to get rid of this knight, bishop takes g6 is followed by pawn takes, king h8, and you take on g8. A beautiful move, because king takes g8 and this is checkmate. Black cannot do anything about this. Another reason why black resigned here is because of the threat of queen takes g8. So let's say we make a random move like queen c2. Queen takes g8, king takes, rook a8, and after king f7, this is a checkmate, which is pretty crazy considering the fact that the kings seem to be running away, but this pawn is taking away that square. So this pawn move to d5 was actually really useful. We saw a few moves earlier. Not only is it trying to promote, but it's also stopping the king from moving away to e6. So that is pretty crazy. And this is why after queen f7, Jan resigned here, and that means we have another match on our hands, guys. I mean, the score is leveled. It's 3-3 now, and it's pretty crazy that the players rarely make draws over here. It's very common in such a high level, high stakes match to make draws, as, you know, the opponents are really close to each other in terms of skills. In this match, they're just beating each other like one by one. It's pretty crazy. Anyways, guys, this was round 6 of the World Chess Championship. Before round 7, the players will have a rest day, so I'm really curious to see what the players will come up with during this time that they will have a rest, and they'll have plenty of time to come up with new ideas and so on. So hope to see you in the next video.